Hello, David, again.
Hello, Ahmed.
And hello to the audience. Thanks for being here. This is quite the achievement, 600 pages of Indonesian history. It's well worth a read. But I'll tell you that I was struck early when reading this book, when you rattled off some of the stats about Indonesia. Some 17,000 islands, nobody's entirely sure how many. If you could place Indonesia in Europe, it would stretch from Ireland to Kazakhstan. It's the first country post-World War II to proclaim its independence. And with its 270 or so million people, it's the fourth most populous country in the entire world. And yet most of us know almost nothing about it here in Sweden. Why is that, do you think?
It's a very good question. Good afternoon, and thank you for giving up 1 hour of your summer to be here. It's strange. I mean, it's such a big country. It's an important country. It has an incredible history. It's an important economic player. It's the third democracy in the world after India and the US, and yet we never talk about it. And it's all the more surprising because right after World War II, as you just summarized, it was the first country to proclaim its independence. And that independence struggle became the format, became the template on how to decolonize. So it had a big impact. Indonesia was worldwide better known in the 1950s and the 1960s than it is today. And it seems as if the country has become rather secluded and we have forgotten all about it. It may be related to the language situation as well. Today's Indonesians mostly speak only one language, Bahasa Indonesia, Indonesian. And the elderly people I interviewed for this book, I interviewed about 200 people, most of them still spoke 3, 4, 5 different languages, including European languages. Today's Indonesians do not travel all that much. Traveling happens within the archipelago. If your country stretches from Ireland to Kazakhstan, you don't need to go abroad to be surprised. And so it seems as if we've forgotten about it. We only mention it when there is a tsunami or a terrorist attack. And apart from that, we forget about it, basically. It's not on the mental map of the West. When I started writing this book, Ahmad, I went to visit bookshops in Amsterdam and in Paris, in New York, and always checking the shelves with Asia and Asian history. And there were more books on North Korea and Afghanistan, which have tiny populations compared to the Indonesians. So conflict-ridden countries are apparently better for book sales.
Yeah, that is true. But I heard somewhere that the seed for this book was planted when you found a copy of a certain book in a library in a small city of Boma in Democratic Republic of the Congo. Is that true?
It's true. My previous big book was on Congo, and I was in Boma, which was the first capital in the early times, end of the 19th, early 20th century. And I met this man. He came out of a Borges short story. He was a librarian without a library. He had been the librarian at the end of the colonial times in the 1950s. And he said, like, oh, you're Belgian, yeah, you're Flemish, yeah. Oh, that's funny. I also have like 300 copies of the Flemish library. But nobody speaks Flemish anymore, and they're rotting away, and termites are eating away. Do you want to have a look at it? So I went to have a look at a book collection from the 1950s. All of a sudden, you understand, I learned a lot about Belgian colonialism. If you read so many bad books, it's no wonder your colonialism turns out the way it did. Luckily, 3 books were interesting. One of them was a Dostoevsky novel. Another one I've forgotten. And the third one was perhaps the most famous book from the Dutch colonial times. It's called Max Havelaar by Multatuli. Multatuli was the nom de plume, the pseudonym of Edward Douwes Dekker, a Dutch colonial public servant who had been so disgusted by colonial policy in the 19th century that he had gone back to Europe and he couldn't go to the Netherlands, so he went to Brussels. So it turns out that Brussels is perhaps a good book for writing on Indonesia, because he sat down and in the space of 1 month he wrote this book called Multatuli. And so here I was, sitting in Congo in 2008, reading the most classic novel of Dutch literature in the 19th century, and I still hadn't read it. But it's a bit like, it's like Moby Dick somehow. It's a patchwork of genres. It's a very strange book, very postmodern, but with a strong humanist ideal. And it struck me how similar Dutch colonialism was to Belgian colonialism. No surprise, because the Belgian king, Leopold II, who started the Belgian Congo, took all his inspiration from the Dutch. How do you colonize? What do you do with the local rulers? How do you apply indirect rules? So a lot of Belgian colonialism was inspired from the Dutch experience. So I was there, I still had to finish, I still had to write Congo, and already had an idea for a second book, and this
is the result.
Yeah, 16 years later. Yeah, it's been a lot of work, these two books, I can tell you.
Yeah, I can imagine. But like you say, we know, so generally speaking, of course, there's always people who know a lot, but generally speaking, we know very little. And you mentioned something in your, I believe it's in the beginning of the book, Eurocentric blinders. What do you mean by that?
Oh, it's the tendency to be more interested in things that are nearby and more recognizable, which is perhaps a fairly human attitude. And yet, in a globalizing world, I think we need to do an effort to develop a more global perspective. It's very funny, at the moment of globalization, I have the impression we're becoming increasingly local, national and even localized. I mean, I come from a country where there's even a tendency where part of the country wants to split the country in even smaller entities. It's a bit strange at the age of globalization. So, and I think we need to do an effort to move beyond the confines of our mental horizon, especially towards those parts of the world that have been so important for the welfare, for the economies we have in the West right now. So we have a sort of colonial debt in terms of, we have a devoir de mémoire, as they say in French, the duty of remembering. And it's more than remembering. I mean, if you look at climate change now, I think it's deeply colonial. We tend to believe, and things are changing, and I hear your work on Black history is also geared towards raising awareness on what has happened in the past, and it's absolutely essential. But colonialism is more than historical colonialism. A few years ago, I saw a map of the world with countries responsible for global warming and countries most vulnerable to the effects of it. And for me, it was a direct copy of the colonial map of the early 20th century. The countries most responsible are the ones from the temperate zones in the Northern Hemisphere. The ones who are the first victims are the tropics, who are not responsible for the carbon gas emissions. So in that sense, there is a deep continuity between the colonialism from the past and the colonialism that we are witnessing now.
I'm skipping ahead a bit now, but now that you mention it, I mean, towards the end of your book, you provide a very interesting case of how colonialism is actually still ongoing on an immense scale. But you write that we in the present colonialize people of the future.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean with this?
Yeah, and obviously what we are plundering future generations. We are drastically limiting their freedom, their health, perhaps their lifespans by the choices we make now. I mean, that's a form of colonization, not in space, but in time. But that colonization of the future is already real today in the southern hemisphere. And I mean, Bangladesh, 17 million people will have to move houses because a third of the country will be underwater. These are quite some developments. Madagascar is experiencing severe famines that are not caused by Madagascar industries, but that are the result of emissions coming from elsewhere, from wealthier countries. So, hence my existence. Why do we need to be beyond a Eurocentric perspective? It's quite easy and quite comfortable to believe that we can basically deal with European history, we can deal with the European politics today, we can deal with the European environment, as if the wealthy lifetimes we are leading here today are not having an impact elsewhere on the planet. I mean, if you look at, it's true, China is the biggest polluter today, fair enough. But if you look at historically who has been, if you calculate the historical emissions, it's the US. And if you include the colonial emissions, and a British NGO recently did it, it's called Carbon Brief, the country that has the largest amount of contributions to climate change over the historical period, including its colonial past, it's the Netherlands. And especially if you divide the historical and the colonial emissions, especially in terms of land use, cutting forests, for mining purposes, for building purposes, for road constructions, railway constructions, building cities. This has been going on for 3.5 centuries. If you include this and you divide it by the tiny size of the country now, there's no population that is carrying such a heavy burden of historical responsibility as the Dutch. So it's a bit too easy to say, like, oh, we're too small and China is too big and they're the culprits. Sure, China is having a responsibility for today, but that doesn't take away that there is a Western responsibility for what has happened in the past.
This discussion that you're referring to now about us sort of colonializing people of the future, is that an ongoing discussion in a place like Indonesia as well?
I don't think it's part of the public debate right now in Indonesia. It's definitely part of the discussion in Pakistan. I mean, 2 years ago, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater as a direct consequence of climate change, and as a corollary at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh and COP at Dubai, so the last 2 COP meetings, Conference of the Parties, where climate policies and climate diplomacy takes place, countries from the south really put this on the table. We're no longer talking about aid here, we're talking about debt. We're talking about loss and damage. And I think this is going to be the most important discussion. Way too long, we've been talking about climate change with the images of, sad, lonely polar bears walking on a dwindling bit of an ice shelf. It's about what is happening to people in other parts of the planet. And so, but it's not a very lively discussion in Indonesia right now. Perhaps because the biggest consequences have not been noted yet, although sea water levels are rising in the Java Sea and might soon be noticed. But I'd be interested to see if a major natural disaster will strike, what the reaction will be.
What will happen, yeah. And I can imagine it's not a very popular discussion to have here in Europe either, or in the Western world.
Oh, but I think we should have it. It's funny, I mean, I write on colonial history, and then very often in the audience, you see a lot of people of color. There's a really lively debate about this, but I'm very much involved with climate change as well, and then the audiences are predominantly white. And I think these audiences should mingle, and I think it's a very, very common battle. If dealing with colonialism only boils down to changing street names and taking away problematic statues and adapting school books, and perhaps restituting artifacts that were stolen, then we're only dealing with the symbols from the past. This is an important discussion, but we have to look at the structure of the present as well. I mean, Total Energies is having a field day as long as post-colonial activists are only talking about street names. Really? I mean, we're making it very easy for them, and I think we should be more organized. And these forces, which are civil society forces, should join their struggles. So that's part of what I try to do. And for me, these battlefields, decolonization, decarbonization, and democratization are intricately linked. And I don't see how you can do one without the other.
When speaking about raising awareness, you also refer to a poll, I believe, that suggested that Dutch people generally tended to be more proud of their colonial past than other Europeans. Is that also tied to awareness or maybe a lack of awareness?
Yeah, I think so. When I was finishing my book, it was really it came in handy. YouGov, which is this British polling bureau, published the results of a poll they had done. Which country is most proud of its overseas empire? And the British researchers assumed like it's going to be us. We had the biggest empire. And so they asked the same questions in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in Japan, the Netherlands, England. And much to their surprise, it was the Dutch who had won the poll. 50%, and this is only just a few years ago. I mean, it's 4 or 5 years ago. 50% of the Dutch declared themselves to be proud of the overseas empire. 50% in 2019. Only 6% was embarrassed about it. In Belgium, it was 25%. And the most surprising figure was that 26% of the Dutch were longing for a new overseas adventure and empire. This is really fun. I mean, I love the Netherlands. I go there. I'm Belgian myself, but it's the foreign country that I know best. I've been living there for a long time. My partner is Dutch. I have a lot of Dutch friends. But something has happened to Dutch history education, which has been detrimental. They have history education came down to learning historical skills. And so you have a whole generation of people who know how to build an argument and who learn how to disagree with you, preferably with arguments. But the empirical understanding is extremely limited.
Is that a new development in the Netherlands?
Well, it's changing now, and I think my book has contributed to a wider movement of shaking up. There's also an initiative called Black History Month, which is waking up. But it's really very recent. And it might be very short-lived if you see which sort of government is now being formed. And one of the first attacks is basically against against the cultural elite and against post-colonialism. Geert Wilders himself has a half-colonial background. One of the reasons why he dyes his hair blonde, Geert Wilders is the leading populist from the Netherlands, who is now the most popular politician, who's been dyeing his hair blonde for most of his adult life. And one of the arguments I've been heard is that he wants to hide his Javanese traits, surprisingly. It was when I was writing this book, and just to show you, when I was writing, I announced that I was working on this book in an interview, and he heard about it, and he put a message on Facebook, "What is this idiot planning to write? He should shut up and write a book on Belgian Congo first." But I had already done so.
Yes.
But it shows the sort of... So for a long time, it was ignorance, and now it's refusal and denial.
And that's not I mean, you can see some of that in America, in the U.S. as well. In Florida, I used to live in Miami, Florida, and their current governor, Ron DeSantis, who really has made a pretty vicious attack against the colleges and universities and trying to combat this awareness raising.
Yeah.
So it seems to be somewhat of a global movement.
Well, if it rains in Miami, it drips in Amsterdam. I think the Dutch regret being part of the European Union and would rather belong to the United States quite often. The gaze is very Anglo-American. There is a massive cultural heavyweight and economic heavyweight country next door. It's called Germany, but it seems like there's an ocean to the east and there's a continent to the west. It seems as if the mental map has changed. And so the gaze towards London, New York, Washington is much more important. And so a lot of political ideas take their inspiration from what is happening overseas and are reframed. And so this sort of attack on a more critical attitude towards colonial past, which I think is important and is necessary, is now coming under attack. And a few years ago, I mean, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, it redid the biggest renovation in its history, and the building was stripped for years. And when it reopened, it had 63 new rooms, beautiful, gorgeous, Van Gogh, Rembrandt, whatever. No, it was mostly Rembrandt. Van Gogh is around the corner. And surprisingly, of these 63 rooms, only one room was dedicated to what was called, euphemistically, Holland overseas. I think that's rather minimal for a country that has had the second largest colonial empire after the British, and that has been active on the three continents of the South for 3 centuries. And it's only now that this museum, for instance, is making moves. And I'm really curious to see what will happen with this new political climate that is now being created.
I mean, and again, that's why a book like this is so important, because it raises this awareness. I mean, but clearly Indonesian history didn't begin with colonialism, and in this book you begin from the pretty much from the beginning of time. But can you paint us a picture of how this region looked in the maybe centuries before the Dutch arrival?
I'll try. It's not an easy one, but it's.
Oh, sorry.
I start the book with Homo erectus. I'm very glad I can skip the first
Yeah,
million
I
years.
tried to help you.
When the Dutch arrived there around 1600, the archipelago did not, I was always told it's the biggest archipelago on Earth. But last night somebody corrected me and told me that Sweden had more islands. So I'm a little bit in doubt now. But it's still geographically, the geographical space is enormous. It was not one political entity. There had been moments of concentrating power with the regional outreach in the 14th century, sometimes stretching as far as what could be seen as Indonesia today, but never with a system of borders. It was rather circles of influence stretching out. Islam had arrived there in centuries before. Even when Marco Polo was arriving there in the Middle Ages at the northern tip of Sumatra, so the northernmost part of Indonesia, the westernmost part as well, he already saw that Muslims were active there, and mostly because of trade on the northern shores of different islands, especially the western part of the archipelago. Islam had been established there, very much part of trading communities. Chinese had been coming there ever since the 12th century. No, even before. There's I quoted a beautiful text from the 7th century where a Chinese monk is writing home from India and saying, yeah, we can all travel to India to study Buddhism, but actually we might as well stay in Sumatra because they have all the books and they have monks and they have the monasteries. So there was already quite some traveling even before Islam. And traveling is not only about trade, gods travel as well. And so when the Dutch arrived there, you have this mosaic. You have a number of Muslim sultanates, small kingdoms, where the king has become a sultan. And where the kingdom has become a sultanate. It's a mosaic. More towards the east, you would find different communities, agricultural communities. Even more towards the east, in New Guinea, you would still find a hunter-gathering community. You still have them today, the Papuas. And so this would be the sort of setting scene. Portuguese had been there. Spaniards were looking for spices. The region was so interesting for European because of spices, of course. And spices had been, I think I have some in my pocket. Yeah, I happen to run around with cloths in my pocket all the time. But it's quite funny that this massive empire started with something as tiny as cloths. How do you call it in Swedish?
Kryddnejlika.
Nejligen, yeah, okay. Yeah, it's like in German, Nelken.
Okay.
And we call it kruidnagelen in Dutch. So it's spice and it looks like a nail, basically. And this was already known in medieval times. Pepper was already known in Roman times. So there was already a lot of trade along the Silk Road with spices, but they were very expensive. Because everything had to go, nobody was going there directly. It had to go through a lot of intermediaries, and the price was obviously rising if every harbor went with every merchant. And then the Portuguese said, let's go there ourselves. We know how to sail. We dare to sail along our coast, and we even dare to go to Morocco. Let's circumvent Africa. Africa cannot be that big. Let's go south, and we turn left as soon as possible. But that took about a century. And then the Spanish said like, yeah, the Portuguese, they're wrong. Let's go west. You know, the Atlantic cannot be that big. And we know that at the other side we should find a country. We know it from the Silk Road. It's called Japan. And Columbus arrives and he said, yeah, this is Japan, but it was Haiti. And then Magallanes had to go south. That was another century. And then the Dutch say, oh, they're wrong, the Spaniards and the Portuguese. Let's go north. Let's circumvent Russia. It cannot be that big. And so Barents, who was this Dutch explorer, he started off in the 16th century. Oh yeah, let's go across Scandinavia, yeah. And then he ended up conveniently in a sea that already was carrying his name, the Barents Sea, where he got stuck on Nova Zembla. And rather than finding Nelken, Klaus, he found polar bears, and he died there himself.
Not what you want.
Not what he wanted. So eventually, the Portuguese route became the route before the Suez Canal was opened in the 19th century. And the Dutch originally did go, so they started in the 17th century, and the idea then was not to start a colony. There was no territorial ambition whatsoever. There was a gastronomic ambition, finding the cloths. They're good, they're healthy, they're tasty, and it's very good for your health. They even have divine qualities. And so the idea was, let's stay on our ships, get the goodies on board, and sail back home. But you had to wait 6 months before the wind turned into your favor. So you might as well go on land and start a depot, a store, a warehouse. But the Portuguese are there and the Spaniards, so let's put four cannons around the depot, the warehouse. That was the first bit of Holland. I mean, about twice the size of this room. This is how it started on the island of Ambon. That was the very first bit where the Dutch flag was raised.
And then later the Dutch East India Company forms, and you write about how the composition of that company almost guaranteed exploitation.
Yeah.
Being a private company with the requirement to turn a profit,
Yep.
but also at the same time having the perks or the responsibilities of a nation.
Yeah.
So I think you write something. I mean, I read the Swedish translation, but you wrote something to the effect of that this endeavor, it was no chance that it would end well.
It had to end badly. I mean, this was the first shareholder company, multinational shareholder company with tradable shares. Unlike a family business where people are mostly patient if the benefit is not for this generation, it's for the next. In Amsterdam in early 17th century, bourgeois people, were buying and selling stocks to the East India Company, hoping to have a quick win. And so these boats were sailing out, commercial enterprise, but they were weaponized, they were militarized, they had diplomatic powers, and they had legal powers to do trade, to establish training posts, to engage in diplomatic conversation, to wage war. I mean, they had the permit to do so. Imagine that Starlink would do such a thing. Well, actually, we're moving to that again with Starlink, perhaps. But it's quite something that had to end up badly, and so a lot of violence was used, especially because the Dutch were so adamant on getting the monopoly on these Spice Islands, which are more in the eastern part of the archipelago, in a sub-archipelago called the Moluccas. They were so adamant on getting the monopolies that they were burning down and cutting down these trees where the cloths were growing, to avoid that the Spaniards and the Portuguese could get at them. And if local inhabitants were selling them to other traders, they got massacred on a massive scale. So the whole financial economic model was burned on forms of genocide. Especially in one small group of islands called the Banda Islands, where in 1621 almost the entire population was wiped out. A couple of thousand people survived and became slaves in what became the capital, Jakarta, Batavia back then. So it started off with a lot of violence, and it was even explicitly taken for granted that trade requires violence and violence requires trade. So it was people were quite outspoken about it.
You sometimes see that people say that the Netherlands colonized Indonesia for 300 years or so, from the 1600s to the 1900s, but it is a bit misleading,
Yeah.
right? Because it took a long time
Yeah.
for the Dutch to gain control over this
Yeah.
wider range of islands.
It went step by step. In the 18th century, spices became less popular. French cooks were bored with I think in Sweden you had the cinnamon rolls. I mean, cinnamon also is a product from that region. It comes from the western part of Sumatra and the eastern part of India. But with the development of 18th century eating culture in France, and that was spreading across Europe as well, spices became a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit banal, and which was a bit of a panic for the Dutch. Now they had their monopoly. They had been fighting and killing for 1 century to get the monopoly. The moment they have it, they're no longer popular. And so, but all of a sudden in the French cuisine, a couple of new beverages arise, and it's tea and coffee. I just went this afternoon, I went to the Nordiska Museum, and it was also on tea drinking culture in Sweden in the 18th century, and how it started as an aristocratic habit, and how it very soon the bourgeoisie picks it up. And that was that for the East Asia Company, that saved them. All of a sudden, okay, they don't want our gloves anymore, but they want coffee, they want tea. Sure, we're gonna make sure. But and that was the first time they needed more land, and they moved away from Moluccas and went to the island of Java, starting plantations of coffee, tea, and sugar canes. Chinese became very powerful in that business as well, and it was only in the 19th century that the ambition of making like this puzzle of the island, this jigsaw puzzle, making sure that we have a total territory, not just a number of trading posts, not just a number of plantations, but having like making sure that we have entire islands and neighboring islands, and making sure that this entire region becomes united under a colonial administration, was a very, very late process. It was mostly after 1850 that it took place, and crucial bits were only added as late as 1914. So the whole puzzle, it took 300 years to lay the puzzle, but the majority of it was only realized in the last decades of the entire project.
So it's clear that it was several different phases
Yes.
of the colonial era, with differences in between them. But is it possible to? It's a big question, but is it possible to broadly give us an idea of what life was like in the colony, both for the Dutch and for the local population?
It's possible. We should do it like the museum that I just visited. You should do it century by century and see how things. They have this beautiful new exhibit on Nordbor, I think it's called in Swedish. But if you would look at, say, like around 1900, once the jigsaw puzzle is made, I think what you would see. Actually, we have even film images in the book. I give. You can find them online. The very first filmed footage from life in the Dutch East in this between 1900 and 1914. You see an incredible social, cultural, economic gap between European women dressed in white with peacock feathers on their hats, walking or being in a carriage, or even in the earliest cars already in the 1910s, against a very, very different sort of local population who is extremely poor. I mean, even if you only just look at the way they are dressed, Europeans are dressed in ways that cover everything in white, luxury dressing. Most of the Indonesian people at the bottom of the organization would be just clad in a loincloth, would work the land, which would be their rice sawas, wet rice planting. They would work with their buffalo under the sun and have perhaps something of a reed hat on their head to protect them from the sun. Incredible differences. And I think if there's one space where the distinctions became so tangible, it's on the boats that were connecting the different islands. I use the metaphor of the sort of the three different decks. These ships all had at least three different decks. Deck number one was for the European passengers, or people from mixed descent if their fathers had a prestigious job. So you would find bankers there, top ranking officers, top civil servants from the colonial administration. And they would have incredible food, incredible meals. They would have private huts with even toilets for themselves, showers. And then on deck number 2, you would have even less people, but they would have like Chinese traders, those who have like shops, supermarkets, a small factory where you make matches or hats or bow ties or whatever. You might find on deck number 2, you might find people from the traditional Javanese or Sumatran aristocratic elites, because these old sultanates, some of the sultans were still around. You still have sultans today in Indonesia. They would be allowed to travel second class, comfortable, still in huts, but huts where you have to share with other people closer to the ship's engine. But the majority of passengers on the ship would have been on the open deck, where you would have only 1.5 square meter, where you sat down, lay down for days on end, together with your barang, your luggage, and very often together with cattle aboard the ship. And so that it was it's more than a metaphor. This is exactly how the society was organized. And the 3 different levels of society were even legally organized differently. A different codex, a different legislation applied to a Dutch 18-year-old who had done something wrong as to a Javanese 18-year-old or anybody from any other country, from any other island, depending on the color of your skin. And for instance, a Javanese teenager, 18-year-old, who had stolen something had to be judged by Javanese law, pronounced by a Dutch judge who was applying Javanese law, and the judge would be seated on a stool. You have these images, and the Javanese suspects were forced to sit down on the ground. So the verticality was really part and parcel on board of the ships, in the courtroom. It was really deeply ingrained in the way the space was organized and the colony was organized.
It reminded me actually about Haiti. Oh, of course, it's a different situation, but in Haiti you also had the colonial class and then the mixed race population in the middle and then the slaves at the bottom, to organize a society in that way and also have different judicial systems for them.
Yeah, interesting.
But if we fast forward to the 1900s, I believe it's the beginning of the 1900s, is when you really see the sort of Indonesian national awakening.
Yeah.
What drove it?
Oh, it's 2 days ago was the celebration. On the 20th of May, you celebrate the Day of National Awakening. And the moment the colony is formally organized, and when the Pax Hollandica, as it was called, was supposed to reign, from day one, it is contested. In the 1910s, in the 1920s, in the 1930s, you have different political movements challenging the Dutch presence there. And already extremely early, compared to African colonialisms, already in the 1912, some people are calling for the independence of Indonesia. In 1912, one of them was the nephew of Edward Douwes Dekker, the writer Multatuli. His nephew, who was half Dutch, half Indonesian, was calling for Dutch independence. And it started off with the aristocratic elites. It might surprise that, to go back to the ship metaphor, it's not people at the bottom who they might be unhappy, but they're too unhappy to be angry. And they just continue to plow their field. It's people who are on deck number 2 and who get the promise to move to deck number 1 through education, who get really frustrated. People who study for 6, 7, 8, 9 years medicine, who get a degree as a medical doctor, and then in court they still have to sit on the floor. Those are the ones who are so frustrated. Mahatma Gandhi did the same thing in India. Before he wore his loincloth, he had a 3-piece suit in London playing the violin, trying to be recognized as a full British citizen, and then seeing that there is this glass ceiling through which you can never break. And that is the moment you turn your back to deck number 1 and you're going to talk about your frustration to deck number 2 and eventually to the masses of deck number 3.
I found that very interesting. Also, you made the comparison to the Congo with Lumumba, who also belonged to the class of sort of Europeanized Africans at the beginning.
Yeah. Lumumba was officially recognized as an évolué, as it was called in Belgium, an evolved one. Terribly paternalistic notion. And I went to the village where he was born and raised, and I interviewed a lot of people who had still met Lumumba, so the guy who was so instrumental in getting Congo independent. And all the villagers had known, so like he was like a white man. He dressed like a colonial. He had a suit. He even asked the village girls to wash his feet as a sort of. And it was only at the moment that his ambition was frustrated that he turns his back. And so that it's a very, very typical dynamic. And this is what we see in Indonesia as well. In the 1910, an elite is getting frustrated. Then it turns very interesting in a political movement that is strongly inspired by Islam. Political Islam becomes the first mass movement, a bit like Christian democracy in Europe, where you mobilize the masses thanks to a politico-religious discourse. In the 1920s, Marxism takes over that role. You have a form of a communist upheaval, even an attempt at a communist revolution. Some of the Indonesian communists, many of them were still Muslims, they were not atheists. Some of them traveled to Moscow to talk to Stalin, and Stalin wrote that they were a little bit too left. Now, if Stalin thinks you're too much on the left, you might be a little bit too early with your revolution, and it failed miserably in 1926-27. And then a third movement arose, late 1920s, early 1930s, which was the nationalist movement, where Sukarno, who became the father of the fatherland, the first president, Sukarno tried to, raise the movement from turn a mass movement. But again, these three movements are very important, but they're not mutually exclusive. You could be a Muslim, a communist, and a nationalist at the same time. And Sukarno's big political project was bringing together these three strands. There were overlapping strands, and he tried to unite them. And even today in Indonesia, there are still dominant political strands, apart from communism, socialism, that has been, ever since the genocide in 1965, has been almost killed and exiled as a political force. But today's dominant political force in Indonesia are political Islam and a form of nationalist secularism.
But so these three big movements challenging the colonial authority, individually they seem to have failed, but they worked when they were sort of more combined.
Combining forces was essential, but in the 1930s it was extremely hard because the Dutch colony became extremely repressive. And I've been interviewing a lot of people, and people told me like, actually the worst period was the end of the colonial rule. The Dutch East Indies became a police state.
It appears almost like an apartheid state.
Oh yeah, I think the period between 1900 and 1920 was a much more progressive period than between 1920 and 1940, where the communist upheaval made the colonizers so nervous that they even created their own sort of internment camp. I mean, dissidents were sent away, like in a gulag. They were sent away to Papua. Hundreds and hundreds of intellectuals were sent away, not just for a couple of months or a couple of years. Some of them spent 15 years in an internment camp in Papua, not being able to escape. And it was, I think, yes, uniting forces was essential, but the repressive climate was such that nothing could have changed. And the Governor General in 1936 said, like, listen, folks, he was very right-wing, by the way, very much inspired by what was happening in Europe in terms of neo-totalitarianism. And he said, like, listen, folks, the Dutch have been here for 300 years. We're going to plan to be here another 300 years. After that, we can talk. He literally said so. But then something happened that nobody could have anticipated. Germany invaded Holland, and Japan took over Indonesia in 1942. And that changed everything.
In what way? What would the Japanese, what role would they play in leading up to the revolution in Indonesia?
They were crucial. The 3.5 years of Japanese military occupation were crucial. The Japanese didn't come to Indonesia to free the Indonesians from the Dutch. That was Japanese war rhetoric. We are your brothers, Asia for the Asians. The Japanese had to go to Indonesia because of the oil. Japan was an industrial nation that was at war with China and badly needed oil. And so it's funny, we all know about Pearl Harbor, Japan attacking the American fleet. But the reason that this happened was that in order to go to Indonesia, to sail south, the American fleet had to be destroyed first. The two dominant maritime powers were the Americans and the British. On the same day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, Singapore was attacked and Malaysia was attacked. Basically making sure that the British and the Americans could not intervene on the sea, so the Japanese fleet could sail south and get at the oil reserves that were very important, mostly in Borneo, Kalimantan, the southern part of Borneo, in Sumatra, etc. I had some incredible witness accounts. I interviewed a Dutch guy who was blowing up the oil refineries in Sumatra just 2 days before the Japanese arrived. It was really interesting, and I could corroborate what he told me. Verwe, his name was, what he told me with Japanese military reports, and his description were very, very accurate. And so the Japanese came there, they're interested in the oil, but in the first shipments, there is already a propaganda division there. The Japanese were incredible in terms of propaganda. Cinema had always been something for the European elites. All of a sudden, cinema is open to the Indonesian themselves. Children can go to the film for the first. Sukarno tells in his autobiography, as a child, yeah, I've seen Western movies, but mirrored, because the audience was sitting in front of the screen, the colonial audience, and we children, we were allowed to sit in the grass on the back of the screen, and we saw the shooting, but in the mirrored view. We saw it from the other side of the screen. In Japanese time, they were allowed to sit on the front row. And the Japanese didn't bring Western movies, they brought Eastern movies on how you should behave, on samurai, on how women should behave, smoking was not allowed. And everything changed. Education changed. The Dutch language disappeared very, very quickly. It's a whole street names changed, radio programs
very
changed.
quickly. It's just a few short years.
Or even in the first couple of months. And then one of the few boats that was sunk when the Japanese arrived was the boat with propaganda, with journalists and cartoonists and filmmakers. So they had to send in a second shipment of propagandists. And then teachers, Japanese teachers. I was interviewing people in homes for the elderly in Jakarta. I was interviewing people in Jakarta, speaking Indonesian, my limited Indonesian, to the nurses, speaking sometimes Dutch to these elderly ladies, and then they would start singing songs in Japanese, writing down the lyrics in Japanese characters in my Belgian notebook. I mean, that's really, and talking with a lot of affection on their, I loved my Japanese teacher so much. She was so kind. She came from Tokyo to teach us. So the Japanese were not there for 3 years. They planned to stay there forever. And so they immediately tried to win the hearts and the minds of the local population. And when they arrived, they were welcomed with open arms by lots of the local population as well.
As liberators, they thought that...
Oh yeah, I traveled to Japan to interview, that was the hardest part of the book, to interview Japanese veterans who had been in Indonesia. You know, in Indonesia, they like to talk, but they don't get so old. In Japan, they get very old, but they don't like to talk about the war. So it was quite an effort to find a number of veterans who wanted to talk. And there was this guy who was 102 years old, and another one was 99 years old. And he said, like, oh yeah, the war in Indonesia, it was just like training. I had been fighting in China. China was awful. It was horrific. It was just rain of bullets. And then you arrived in Indonesia, and these gorgeous women came along with baskets full of papayas and mangoes and things we had never seen. And they had scampis, beautiful scampis. So it was really, for them it was an easy war. Yeah.
But in 1945 is when we see I guess the official beginning of the Indonesian revolution. What do you think sets it apart from other revolutions that we might be more familiar with here in Europe?
I think its most defining characteristic is our ignorance. It's the more I think about it, the more I see it as an event of global proportions. But there's something funny with revolutions. If they happen in the Northern Hemisphere, it's world history, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. If it happens in the Southern Hemisphere, it's seen as national history. The Haitian Revolution, the Indonesian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is now at a tipping point. Last 10 years, we've come to realize the revolution from 1804, very much influeed by the French Revolution. The first country that got independent from colonial rule. Now we start to see how important Haiti is. It's going to take another 10 years, 20 years before we realize how important the Indonesian Revolution was. Because in Holland, it's seen as national history, and in Indonesia as well, it's seen as national history. Oh, we got our freedom thanks to a revolution. But it's the subtitle of the book is the Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World. It's set in motion such an important dynamic. It was the first country that proclaimed its independence. It had to fight for its freedom. And the template on how to decolonize was made in Indonesia and was then exported to Africa. And that template consisted of a number of criterions. Independence had to be total, all the powers, all the territories, and it had to be quick. That model, that way of decolonizing was very different from what Western powers were suggesting, a gradual evolution. Foreign affairs, we're going to be in charge of foreign affairs. The Indonesian Revolution inspired a whole range of political figures in the Arab world, in Africa, in Latin America, on how to decolonize. And I think it's been really, somebody like Lumumba was indirectly influenced by what he had seen in Ghana, and Ghana was very, very much influenced by what happened in Indonesia.
And you see that even 10 years after the Indonesian Revolution started, in 1955, you have the Bandung Conference.
Yeah.
Very influential conference with countries from Asia, Africa, and the Arab world, and not really Western presence.
Yeah.
And like I said, it was very influential. And I came across it the first time studying the American Civil Rights Movement. And I saw it mentioned in the writings of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. They were both very inspired by that conference. And I think it's a fascinating period that people from different cultures and different backgrounds and religious backgrounds and even races, if you want to use that word, could find common ground.
Yeah.
But that Bandung spirit seems to have gone away pretty quickly.
Yeah, the Bandung Conference was the first conference of the world without the West, basically, without white people. And it did not institutionalize. There was going to be a second Bandung Conference. People in America were hoping for a Bandung Conference in the Bronx. They were planning a second Bandung Conference in Algeria, but Western powers, and especially the CIA, did everything to stop it, because they were afraid that the spirit of Bandung was going to lead to a form of global communism. And so it was violently repressed. And the metaphor for that repression was called the Jakarta method. What happened in Chile, what happened in Indonesia, what happened in Congo. I mean, how many coups d'etats in the 1960s were not staged with the help of the CIA? All this was basically done to make sure that regimes were going to be put in place that were very often corrupt, militarized, autocratic, but were on the side of the Americans. In Congo, Mobutu was put in power in the same month as Suharto took power or grabbed power in Indonesia. And the CIA said about Mobutu, well, he's a bastard, but at least he's our bastard. And so the Bandung movement was, I think, one of the most hopeful movements of the 20th century. And unfortunately, its dynamic was grounded to a halt by Western powers. But I think its lasting legacy is what it did to the United Nations. The UN were raised after World War II, mostly as a fairly Western organization. And after the Bandung Conference, the participating countries very quickly became associate members and full members of the United Nations. And in the years after, the whole decolonization movement was inspired by the Bandung movement as well. So Bandung was essential in globalizing the United Nations. And in that respect, I think we're talking here about one of the key developments of mid-20th century international politics. But I don't think Westerners are fully aware of what basically happened there, and I think it's important to know this. We always been thinking that United Nations was there as a sort of global organization to make sure that World War III was not going to happen. But it started off as a very Western organization. Eventually, it was only after Bandung it became fully globalized. And I think that's the real legacy. And today, I mean, to come back to the discussion we just had, if Pakistan, if other countries from the south are now claiming loss and damage to Western countries, it's thanks to it's actually rekindling the Bandung movement, organizing yourself against forms of discrimination that are around in the world.
I could go on forever. I think we have we're inching close to an hour right now, and I think we should maybe open the floor up if we have some questions for from the audience. It has to be brief, though, and it has to be an actual question. I see one there in the middle. Okay.
Yes. Hello, David. My name is also David. I'm also Belgian, but I'm really crap at writing books. So, but my question to you is that if I look around here, I see very few Indonesian people. And my question is, how has the book been received in Indonesia and by Indonesians themselves?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. The translation in Indonesian is still underway, but it has already been reviewed ever since the Dutch original came out. And it's been, much to my surprise and relief, I have to say, it's been extremely well received by Indonesian press. And now with the English translation coming out, it's getting a bigger audience in Indonesia as well. There's not a big book reading culture in Indonesia, but it's now, the English translation is really finding its way. I got a message just 2 weeks ago from a book chain called Periplus. It's like the most important book chain in Indonesia. And they said like, we're selling your book to a lot of people, to expats as well. But so far the reception has been very warm. And the thing I hear most about it is like, it's great to see the story of our country narrated in some detail. But the whole international dimension is something that is not very well known in Indonesia either. It's very funny. Colonial histories are mostly remembered as national histories, both in the former colonies and the former metropoles. And what I try to do is to reframe them as global histories. I think the decolonization movement is one of the key events of the 20th century. And so Indonesians are proud to learn that their struggle was not just important for their country, but inspired Egypt, inspired Ghana, had echoes by Che Guevara. It's Che Guevara, Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. They're all referring to the Indonesian independence, and so for them it's a new source of pride, so to speak. Yes.
We haven't had time to talk about it really here, but one of the things that makes this book really stand out as well is that the way you weave in oral history. I mean, you've interviewed close to 200 people in this book.
Yeah.
And that's not to me, that's not that common in history books.
Yeah, it's true. And yet it's such a privilege. I love doing interviews. I'd rather sit on that chair than on this one. But no, it's just, especially when you're studying a society where most people do not have access to the written word because they're illiterate, or the archives are not built by them. The colonial archives we have are colonial archives. So you have to counterbalance that with perspectives from below, from people whose voices never enter. One of the first interviews I did was in a home for the elderly in Jakarta. This was an elderly lady. I arrived and she was on a bed, and I thought like, it's too late. I mean, I didn't feel comfortable. I said, I brought a gift. I just left the gift, and I said, like, let's not. And then she started talking and talking and talking, how she, as a 14-year-old, had been in the war, and how she had joined the rebels and the independence fighter, first as a nurse and then as a soldier, how she had taken the boat from Java to Borneo to sleep on the ground. She was more afraid of orangutans than the Dutch. The Dutch didn't intimidate her. And then she started singing songs from the war. And these are sort of voices that are not part and parcel of the Dutch colonial archives. I mean, how could they have ever entered?
Yeah.
She would have been shot first. So so I love doing interviews. Yeah.
I think we had one. Did we have one more question in the back? Okay.
I am from Ceylon.
Where?
Ceylon,
Okay.
which was also colonized by the Dutch.
Yeah.
And for cinnamon, basically.
Yeah.
But my unhappy stay was in Belgium, in the French part, in the Wallonian region, in Louvain. But I can go on saying this. But I'll ask a question. You rightly say you are fond of oral history rather than archival history.
Yes.
And Pratomo is what you interview, and Siska
Patipilohi.
in the end. But they the memory, the Alzheimer's disease and memory is a problem.
Yeah.
In the archival history, reputation.
Yeah.
In oral history, in memory. Memory is a problem. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, it's true. I was interviewing a lot of elderly people. Thank you for your question, by the way. Sometimes people had forgotten things, but what surprised me is that very often people had more memories of what they had done in their 20s than what they had done on Tuesday afternoon. I've been talking to people who did not remember what they had had for lunch, or they had forgotten they had lunch, and yet these crucial memories, especially if they are related to violence they have seen, traumas do not disappear. Even if all other memories lay down in the empty landscape, traumas are there like shiny pillars of basalt. And it was impressive sometimes to hear the amount of detail people could bring up. Siska Patipilohi, who is still alive, she's well in her 90s now. She lives in Amsterdam, but she was an incredible witness. Pratomo died in the meantime. He was my oldest witness. I interviewed him when he was 102 years old, and he was buried on the day of his 104th anniversary. I went to his funeral in the Netherlands. His story, when I interviewed him, was much more fragmented, but luckily his family had a good archive, so I could combine what he was telling me in interviews and what I could find in the archive. He was one of the few Indonesians in the Netherlands in the 1930s. He had been a resistance fighter when the Germans arrived. It's incredible. He hated the Dutch, but he hated German fascists even more. And he had ended up in Dachau. He had been one of the very, 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 very few Asians in. I think he had been the first or perhaps one of the second Indonesian in Dachau. And when I interviewed him, his daughter said, "David, you can ask any question, but don't start about Dachau," which I did not do. And then he started talking about it himself, spontaneously. And the few phrases he said made it clear that this memory was entirely intact, painfully intact. And his daughter told me the day after, like, he had been having nightmares last night, but I'm so grateful that he told the story. And then I could verify with his letters that he had been sending from Dachau, etc. But it's a very important question, and sometimes you have to check and double check, and sometimes you're not quite sure, and then I haven't put it in the book. Yeah.
You have any last question? I have one. I know that we're running short on time, but I have one short question. I mean, in the introduction, you write that anyone who have doubts about whether young people can make a difference in the struggle against, for example, global warming or biodiversity laws, they need to study Indonesian history. Why is that?
The Revolusi was realized by teenagers, or people between the age of 14 and 24 perhaps. And I was writing the book at the moment when, it's funny to say this in Stockholm, but when Greta Thunberg started her campaign, and people in my country, in the Netherlands, as everywhere else, a lot of people were critical about it and did it away with like a gesture, like dismissed it as like, oh, those teenagers, they should go to school, they don't know enough, their role, it's too early for them to do politics. And I said, well, if you don't believe that younger generations are a powerful political force, think again and have a look at Indonesian history. I only hope that young activists for the climate might use a little bit less violence than the Indonesian revolutionaries, but do not underestimate the power of the younger generations. That's what I was planning to say.
Well, David, thank you very much for joining us today and for writing this incredible book. I think I saw a bunch of copies out there in the hallway in case anyone wants to buy one on your way home.
Right.
Thank you to the audience who came and listened.
Right. Thanks to my editor and thanks to the translator as well, who's not here, but I think if you applaud in a minute, you applaud for Joachim Sundström as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ska bara kort säga att det här samtalet arrades i samarbete med bokförlaget Natur och kultur. Och att boken finns att köpa här nere och David kommer alldeles strax att komma och signera.